In the summer of 1852, a daguerreotype was taken at Ravens Hollow Plantation in rural Georgia. A photograph of 12 children arranged formally on the front steps of the main house, their faces pressed into the solemn composure demanded by the technology of early photography. For over 150 years, this image lay hidden in a private family collection, dismissed as a curiosity of the antebellum South. Filed away in leather cases alongside dozens of other formal Victorian portraits that meant nothing to modern eyes. But when historians and forensic genealogists examined it in 2019, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through the academic and legal communities. Every single child in that photograph was the biological offspring of enslaved women and the plantation's white family. The discovery wasn't just a revelation of paternity, it was evidence of a deliberate, systematized breeding program designed to increase the enslaved population and consolidate familial power across decades. The photograph, once innocuous and forgotten, became a document of profound historical violence. The faces of those 12 children, some bearing unmistakable resemblance to the plantation family's documented portraits, others showing the unmistakable trauma of childhood existence within a system designed to destroy them, stared directly into the camera with an eerie, hollow composure that contemporary observers found profoundly disturbing. Scientists, archivists, genealogists, and descendants would spend years uncovering the machinery of Ravens Hollow's darkness, doctored birth records spanning decades, destroyed ledgers recovered from fire-damaged safes, oral histories suppressed for generations through deliberate family silence, and the systematic erasure of identity that followed the Civil War's legal restructuring. What emerged was not simply a historical curiosity. It was the revelation of how institutions, legal systems, church records, military documentation had conspired to make the impossible disappear. The 12 children existed. They had been documented. Their existence had been profitable. Yet the official historical record had absorbed them into nothing, left them scattered across time and geography, severed from their mothers, severed from each other, severed from any rightful claim to inheritance or dignity. This is the story of how one photograph cracked open a century-old conspiracy of silence. This is the story of what happens when the machinery of institutional erasure is finally examined from the inside. This is the story of Ravens Hollow, a plantation whose secrets survived in plain sight, hidden not in obscurity, but in the very archives designed to preserve historical memory. Chapter 1. The photograph surfaces. 96 years after the daguerreotype was taken in 1852, Ravens Hollow Plantation had long been subdivided, sold piecemeal to investors who had no particular interest in its history, and partially reclaimed by the aggressive kudzu and red clay of rural Georgia. The original manor house, a columned Greek revival structure that had once dominated the landscape, had burned in 1943 under circumstances that were never fully clarified. The official explanation was an accident involving a knocked-over lamp, though locals whispered of arson, though descendants of those who had lived there spoke in guarded terms of deliberate erasure. By the early 2000s, only the brick foundation remained, fragmentary and half-buried, and a handful of slave quarters, weather-beaten structures gradually disappearing into the earth, served as mute testimony to what had been. The landowners who controlled the property in the 21st century were primarily investment firms and real estate development companies that had purchased the acreage for speculative purposes. They had no particular interest in preserving ruins. The foundation and the quarters were simply obstacles to modern development, reminders of an era that most people, particularly those who benefited from historical forgetting, wanted left behind. There were conversations about demolition, about clearing the site, about erasing even the fragments that remained. But in 2019, a routine estate sale of a private collector's property in Richmond, Virginia, included a collection of daguerreotypes packed in deteriorating leather cases. Their surfaces darkened by age and exposure, their images becoming increasingly difficult to discern without specialized knowledge. Among the dozens of portraits in the collection, family photographs of wealthy Georgian merchants, civic leaders, military officers, was the photograph. 12 children, arranged in descending height on the steps of a columned house, all dressed in formal Victorian clothing. The children ranged in apparent age from perhaps 5 years old to 16, and their skin tones varied across the visible spectrum from very light to very dark, suggesting multiple racial ancestries visible in a single photograph. The daguerreotype bore no inscription, no name, no date, no explanation. The seller's catalogue, compiled by an estate assessor with minimal historical knowledge, merely listed it as Antebellum Family Portrait, Georgia, circa 1840-1860s, a categorization that suggested nothing out of the ordinary to potential buyers. Dozens of similar family portraits existed in such collections, the visual record of antebellum prosperity and social hierarchies. No one particular photograph stood out. The image was catalogued, priced modestly, and placed in an auction listing that would have attracted primarily regional collectors and historical enthusiasts. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, a historian in her late 40s who had spent 2 decades studying plantation archives and genealogical anomalies, purchased the collection as part of a broader research initiative funded by a small university grant. She had built her career on a specific hypothesis that plantation records, particularly birth records, contained systemic inconsistencies that revealed not administrative confusion but deliberate manipulation. She had learned to read the gaps in archival documentation, to identify when children appeared in one registry and disappeared in another, to recognize the patterns of erasure that suggested intentional removal from the historical record. Whitmore worked from a small office at the university, surrounded by filing cabinets filled with photocopies of plantation documents, genealogical charts pinned to corkboards, and stacks of academic journals containing articles about slavery, reproduction, and institutional power. She had published work on how plantation ledgers obscured paternity, how birth records were manipulated to obscure family relationships, how entire networks of biological kinship could be erased through careful administrative practice. Her colleagues respected her work, but acknowledged that the field was emotionally and intellectually exhausting. Spending days reading the administrative details of human exploitation required a particular kind of mental fortitude. When the daguerreotypes arrived at her office, Whitmore initially skimmed through them quickly, cataloguing them by approximate date and subject matter. But when she examined the family portrait containing the 12 children, she paused. She had developed an intuition, sharpened by years of archival work, for photographs that contained hidden information. The composition of this photograph was unusual. The children's arrangement seemed deliberately formal, almost anatomical in its precision, and the variation in skin tones, visible even in the aged daguerreotype, suggested something more complex than a typical extended family portrait. She requested specialized photographic equipment from the university's art history department and had the daguerreotype digitally enhanced, photographed under controlled lighting conditions and analyzed with high magnification imaging. Under magnification, the details became clearer. The children's facial features didn't conform to typical sibling resemblance patterns. Some bore striking similarities to architectural details visible in the background of the photograph, the precise composition of the columned house that appeared behind them. She recognized those columns. She had seen them before in historical records of Ravenshollow. Over the course of 3 weeks, in September 2019, Whitmore began running genealogical analyses, cross-referencing the children's presumed ages, estimated by physical appearance and historical photographic practices, with plantation records that she had previously digitized. She conducted searches through multiple archival databases, searching for individuals who matched the approximate birth years, geographic locations, and name patterns that might have appeared in official records. Within 3 weeks, with the assistance of a genealogist named Marcus Johnson, who worked at the Georgia State Archives, she had tentatively identified 5 of the 12 children. What she found violated every conventional understanding of genealogical documentation. The 5 children appeared in historical records under different names, in different family trees, in different institutional contexts, as if they existed in multiple official realities simultaneously. One child, catalogued as Margaret in plantation records from 1852, appeared in the 1860 census records as Margaret Freeman. Another, listed as Samuel in the plantation ledgers, appeared in 1870 military records as Samuel Foster. A third appeared under 3 different surnames in 3 different archival databases across a 20-year span. But the crucial discovery came when Whitmore began comparing the children's presumed birth dates with entries in Ravenshollow's official plantation ledgers. The ledgers documented enslaved population statistics with meticulous detail: births, deaths, purchases, sales, and demographic information. When Whitmore matched the 12 children against the ledger entries, she found something extraordinary. Most of the 12 children were documented in the ledgers as born during specific years: 1835, 1838, 1841, 1845, 1848, 1849, and so on. But they were not listed as siblings. They were scattered across different family groupings, attributed to different mothers, documented with different parentage notations. Most disturbingly, when Whitmore cross-referenced the children in the plantation ledgers against Ravenshollow family genealogies maintained by the State Historical Society, she discovered references suggesting that some of these same children appeared in the White family's genealogical records under different names and with different birth years. It was as if the same individuals had been deliberately catalogued as existing in multiple separate family structures, their biological relationships deliberately obscured, their identity fragmented across institutional records. By September 2019, Whitmore had published her preliminary findings in the Journal of American Historical Research. Her article, titled Genealogical Erasure and Systematic Reproduction, Methodological Approaches to Identifying Concealed Kinship Networks in Antebellum Plantation Records, carefully documented her methodology, presented her findings with appropriate scholarly caution, and posed a hypothesis that was shocking in its implications. The photograph appeared to document a family unit that had been deliberately fragmented and concealed across multiple institutional records. The children were not siblings in the conventional sense. They were not a typical enslaved family. They were biological children of enslaved women and the Ravenshollow family patriarchs, systematically documented within a breeding program designed to increase enslaved population while obscuring paternity. The response from the academic community was mixed, contentious, and revealing. Some scholars praised the detective work, acknowledging the methodological sophistication of Whitmore's genealogical analysis. Others demanded irrefutable proof, questioning whether DNA testing could confirm biological relationships, whether additional archival documentation could substantiate the hypothesis. Still others, a quieter but significant group, seemed uncomfortable with the implication that the historical record itself was a conspiracy, that archives were not neutral repositories of truth, but instruments of institutional power designed to obscure crimes. Whitmore knew she had uncovered the tip of something enormous, but she also knew that revealing what lay beneath would require descending into darkness that most people preferred to leave undisturbed: the machinery of reproductive violence, the systematic commodification of human beings, the institutional apparatus designed to make these crimes invisible. She spent the winter of 2019 preparing for what would become years of investigation into what happened to the 12 children of Ravenshollow after the photograph was taken. Chapter 2. The Ledger's Lie. The original plantation ledgers of Ravenshollow had survived in fragments, scattered across multiple archival locations. The most significant collection, 3 leather-bound volumes detailing births, deaths, purchases, sales, work assignments and demographic management, was housed in the Georgia State Archives, preserved but deliberately minimized in historical significance. Most scholars who consulted these documents approached them as routine administrative records, the bureaucratic documentation of enslaved population management that characterized all large plantations in the antebellum South. They were housed in climate-controlled storage, treated with preservation chemicals, made available to qualified researchers through formal request processes. Yet their very institutional treatment, their placement within the archive, their classification within finding aids, suggested that they contained nothing extraordinary, nothing that required particular scrutiny or critical examination. But when Dr. Whitmore began cross-referencing the ledger entries with the daguerreotype subjects and their presumed ages, discrepancies emerged like cracks in a carefully maintained facade. Between 1820 and 1850, the Ravenshollow ledgers documented 43 births among the enslaved population. This number was extraordinary for the period in ways that Whitmore and her research partner Marcus Johnson recognized immediately. Plantation records from across the South typically showed lower birth rates. Malnutrition was endemic in enslaved communities, resulting in reduced fertility and higher rates of miscarriage. Deliberate spacing restrictions were often imposed by slaveholders seeking to control reproduction. Disease, overwork, and the general brutality of enslaved existence resulted in higher infant and child mortality rates. A birth rate of 43 successful births over 3 decades at a plantation of Ravenshollow size was not simply unusual. It suggested something systematic, something deliberate, something designed. Whitmore obtained institutional permission to conduct forensic analysis on the original ledgers, examining them directly rather than relying on photocopies or microfilm. The process required special handling protocols, approval from the Archives Conservation Department, and signed agreements about preservation and care. When she finally held the ledgers in her hands, leather covers worn and darkened by age, pages yellowed to a fragile amber, the handwriting of multiple 19th-century clerks visible across the documents, she began the meticulous work of forensic documentation. What emerged over weeks of careful examination was a pattern of deliberate manipulation that violated basic principles of institutional record-keeping. Certain entries had been made in different inks and different hands at different times, suggesting that they had not been recorded simultaneously but rather added later, interpolated into the ledger pages with the specific intention of creating a particular documentary appearance. Birth dates for multiple children clustered around specific periods, particularly clustered around documented absences of the plantation patriarch from Georgia. Other entries bore visible signs of erasure and overwriting, where original text had been scraped away and new text written over it, leaving faint but visible traces of the original entries beneath. Most chillingly, when Whitmore examined 6 entries for children documented as born between 1834 and 1840, she found something extraordinary. These 6 children appeared in the plantation ledgers with one name, recorded as the biological children of an enslaved woman and listed with no paternity notation. Yet when Whitmore searched Georgia court records from the 1870s and 1880s, records from after the Civil War, when legal proceedings regarding inheritance, property, and legitimacy became recorded in state archives, she found these same 6 individuals appearing under completely different identities. They had been removed from the enslaved registry and reclassified into the white family genealogy, at least informally, at least in ways that suggested they had been given access to property, education, or other benefits not typically available to the black population. In March 2020, genealogist Marcus Johnson made a discovery that expanded the implications of Whitmore's findings. He began searching marriage records from Ravens Hollow, institutional documentation of enslaved marriages that slaveholders permitted, documented, and recorded for administrative purposes. Between 1810 and 1845, the Ravens Hollow ledgers documented 6 marriages among their enslaved population. The documentation was sparse, typically just names, dates, and brief notations. But when Johnson traced these couples through subsequent records, searching for documentation of children resulting from these unions, looking for evidence of the couples remaining together, examining whether the marriages appeared in any other institutional contexts, he found something bizarre. The documented enslaved couples disappeared. No children were ever attributed to any of these documented unions in subsequent records. Instead, children attributed to other pairings or to no documented paternity began appearing in the ledgers shortly after these marriages were recorded. It was as if the marriages had been recorded for administrative purposes. Then the couples had been systematically separated, dispersed, or erased from the documentary record. Johnson and Whitmore began to construct a hypothesis. The marriages recorded in the plantation ledgers were not unions between enslaved people. They were administrative cover stories, falsifications designed to create a veneer of legitimacy over institutionalized sexual violence. Over the course of 2020, Whitmore and Johnson conducted a meticulous analysis of birth record patterns. They created spreadsheets comparing the dates of recorded enslaved marriages to the dates of recorded births of children attributed to enslaved women. They cross-referenced plantation work assignments, looking for patterns of which enslaved women were assigned to work in the main house versus field labor. They examined the spatial organization of the plantation itself, looking at where enslaved quarters were located relative to the big house and where records indicated specific individuals had been housed. What emerged from this analysis was a profoundly disturbing pattern. Enslaved women who bore children within months of recorded marriages were typically transferred off the plantation or their records were destroyed. Enslaved women who bore multiple children with no documented paternity were systematically housed closer to the main house. The pattern suggested deliberate reproductive management, specific women being selected, managed, monitored through their pregnancies, and their children then being distributed within specific institutional frameworks. In May 2020, Whitmore attended a conference at the University of Virginia focused on plantation archives and reproductive history. There she met Dr. Regina Wells, a historian specializing in enslaved reproduction and medical exploitation. When Whitmore presented her preliminary findings about Ravens Hollow, Wells recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen similar documentation from other plantations in the Deep South, places where pregnancy rates had been deliberately elevated, where enslaved women had been subjected to medical interventions designed to increase fecundity, where reproduction itself had become systematized and managed like any other aspect of the plantation enterprise. Wells and Whitmore began a collaboration that would fundamentally expand the scope of the Ravens Hollow investigation. Together, they examined the plantation ledgers in context with contemporary medical literature from the period, with the few surviving accounts from enslaved women who had documented their experiences, with archival records from other plantations that had similarly elevated birth rates. The evidence accumulated, Ravenshollow was not unique, but it appeared to have been exceptionally systematic, exceptionally deliberate, exceptionally documented. By 2021, Whitmore and Johnson had begun to reconstruct the human cost behind the numerical inconsistencies. Behind each ledger entry was a person. Behind each marriage record was a deliberate deception. Behind each birth documentation was a woman's body subjected to systematic reproductive violence. Behind each child listed in the ledgers was an individual whose identity had been deliberately fragmented, whose family relationships had been deliberately obscured, whose very existence had been transformed into commodity and erasure. The machinery of Ravenshollow's ledgers began to reveal itself, not as administrative confusion, but as systematic conspiracy. The ledgers were not records of what had occurred. They were instruments of control, designed to obscure crimes, to fragment identity, to make the unmistakable disappear into the density of administrative language. And for 170 years they had succeeded. Only the photograph, accidentally preserved, accidentally surviving, had provided evidence that contradicted the official story written in those ledgers. Chapter 3. The silence that echoed. The oral histories of the descendants of Ravenshollow's enslaved population had survived in fragments, preserved through generations in family stories passed down, with a guardedness that suggested shame, trauma, and enforced silence. These were stories told in hushed tones, in incomplete narratives, in allusions and implications, rather than direct statements. They were stories that carried the weight of trauma, but lacked the specific details that might have made them comprehensible to outsiders. They were stories suppressed, controlled, managed through elaborate systems of family silence that had endured for generations. When Dr. Sarah Whitmore began interviewing families in rural Georgia communities surrounding the site of what had been Ravenshollow, she encountered this silence directly. She conducted interviews with descendants, distributed flyers, reached out through community organizations and historical societies. The response was initially limited. Many people were reluctant to speak with an academic researcher, a white woman asking questions about their family histories, their trauma, their connection to slavery and plantation violence. There was, understandably, skepticism about whether speaking would be beneficial, whether historical documentation served the interests of the descendants themselves, or whether it simply fed academic careers while leaving communities unchanged. But slowly, carefully, through patience and demonstrated respect for the interviewee's expertise, connections began to form. An elderly woman named Josephine Carter, whose family had been enslaved at Ravenshollow, initially refused to speak with Whitmore. But when Whitmore showed her the daguerreotype, the photograph of the 12 children, something shifted. Josephine stared at the image for a long time without speaking. Then she wept. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and measured, each word seeming to cost her something. Her great-great-grandmother, she said, had been among the enslaved women at Ravenshollow. The family stories, passed down through her mother and her grandmother, spoke of children who had been born but not kept, children taken from their mothers at birth or within weeks. Some were said to have been raised within the white family household, visible but never acknowledged, given food and shelter but denied any real familial relationship, existing in a kind of liminal space between slavery and membership in the family. Other children had disappeared entirely, sold away or transferred to other plantations, or simply ceased to exist in any documented form. Josephine's family had been forbidden from speaking about these children directly. The silence was so complete, so total, that Josephine's own mother had never fully explained it to her, only alluded to shameful things and matters that were best left buried. Josephine had grown up understanding that there was something hidden in her family history, some trauma or violation that was too painful or too dangerous to discuss directly. She had never known the specificity of what had been done to her ancestors. She had only known that there was something to be ashamed of, something that had permanently damaged her family. "When I look at this picture," Josephine told Whitmore, pointing at the daguerreotype, "I see my family's story written in their faces. These are the children who were taken. These are the ones who were erased. My grandmother never told me this directly, but she told me there were children that belonged to us, but that we could never claim. I didn't understand what she meant, but now I think maybe one of these children is my relative. Maybe my family's shame is written right here." Over the course of 2020 and 2021, Whitmore interviewed dozens of descendants of Ravenshollow's enslaved population. A pattern emerged from these interviews that corroborated and expanded the documentary evidence. Multiple family oral histories referenced specific locations: a place where women were kept, a place where children were born, a place where mothers and children were separated. They referenced specific practices: women being monitored during pregnancy, medical examinations being conducted, children being removed from their mothers after birth. They referenced specific psychological impacts: generations of family members knowing that they had siblings, cousins, relatives, but being unable to claim these relationships, unable to acknowledge them, unable to maintain kinship ties. One family history, preserved by a woman named Patricia Thompson, whose lineage traced back through 6 generations of Ravenshollow descendants, included specific references to a breeding place, a term used almost as code within the family. This was not necessarily a specific location, but rather a collection of practices, a systematic approach to managing reproduction that had been understood by family members as deliberate and intentional. Patricia's grandmother had used this term in conversations, explaining that certain women had been kept at Ravenshollow specifically for this purpose, that their pregnancies had been managed, monitored, and the resulting children had been distributed to serve family interests. In North Carolina, in a climate-controlled research facility affiliated with Duke University, researcher David Hampton discovered something extraordinary: a handwritten manuscript filling approximately 300 pages of a leather-bound journal lay in an archival box labeled Personal Documents, circa 1940s, provenance unknown. The manuscript was a confession, written by someone identified only as J.H. and dated 1946. The author identified himself as the great-nephew of an overseer who had worked at Ravenshollow for 40 years, and he was writing to document what his great-uncle had confided to him about the practices conducted at the plantation. The confession described in clinical detail the mechanics of systematic reproduction at Ravenshollow. It documented how enslaved women were medically monitored, how their menstrual cycles were tracked, how pregnancies were managed according to the plantation family's needs and preferences. It described how births were deliberate, orchestrated to produce children during specific seasons, how infants were separated from their mothers according to administrative decisions about their future utility. It described how children were redistributed, some kept on the plantation, others sold away, some absorbed into the white family's informal structures. Most disturbingly, the confession suggested that some of the 12 children in the 1852 photograph had been deliberately dressed and posed as a kind of perverted family portrait, a documentation of the family's expanding biological enterprise, visible only to those within the conspiracy of power. The author wrote, "I was told by my great-uncle that the photograph was commissioned specifically to document what he called the success of the breeding program. He spoke of these children as proof of the plantation's financial management and biological planning. The photograph was created for the family's private satisfaction, a visual record of their achievement in expanding their enslaved workforce through deliberate reproductive management. It was never intended to be public. It was a private trophy. The photograph in this context wasn't merely a record of family members, it was documentation of what the plantation family considered their triumph. It was evidence of their reproductive management program, created for the satisfaction of those who had orchestrated it, meant to be seen and understood by only those within the power structure. That it survived, that it was eventually discovered by researchers, that its meaning was eventually translated into historical understanding. This was not what the planters had intended. They had created a document designed to prove their control, and it became evidence of their crimes. Before you continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we unearth the secrets buried by official history and give voice to what has been silenced. The story of Ravens Hollow is one that demanded to be told, despite centuries of deliberate suppression. Stay with us as we uncover what was buried. Chapter 4. The Machinery of Erasure. Between 1852 and 1865, the 12 children documented in the daguerreotype were dispersed across space and time, their connections severed, their identities fragmented, their family relationships systematically destroyed. Historical records become fragmentary at this point, deliberately so, it seemed, as if institutional documentation itself had been designed to obscure what happened to these individuals. But the pattern of erasure is evident to those who know how to read it, to those who understand that the absence of documentation is itself a kind of documentation, that the gaps in the record reveal the deliberate effort to create those gaps. 3 of the documented children appear in military records from the Civil War era. 1, recorded in the 1852 plantation ledgers as Thomas, enlisted in 1863 in a segregated military unit recruited from Georgia. The military records identify him as Thomas Freeman, age 28, formerly enslaved. The shift in surname is striking, from the plantation name to Freeman, a name that carried explicit implications about legal status. But there is no explanation in the military records of how an enslaved person became eligible for military service, no documentation of his liberation, no evidence of how the transition from enslaved status to military service was accomplished. His existence appears to jump from one institutional category to another, his documentation transformed by military bureaucracy, but his actual circumstances remaining opaque. A second child, recorded in plantation records as Margaret, appears in similar military records from 1864, recruited as a laundress for a segregated regiment. Her name in the military records is listed as Margaret Foster, and her prior status is documented simply as freed woman, without explanation of how freedom was achieved or when liberation occurred. A third child, Samuel, appears in fragmentary military records as a laborer attached to a regiment, again with minimal documentation of his status or circumstances. But the other 9 children documented in the photograph seem to disappear from all official records during the war years. No military service, no freedom papers, no census documentation, no trace of their existence in the historical record between 1862 and 1865. They vanish from the documentation completely, leaving no evidence of what happened to them. Did they die? Were they sold? Were they transferred to other plantations? Were they absorbed into unmarked mass graves? The silence of the historical record is absolute. Yet they reappear after the Civil War ended, and when they do, their circumstances are profoundly transformed. The reappearance is fragmentary and scattered. One, listed in plantation ledgers as Samuel, emerges in 1870 census records as Samuel Freeman, a laborer in Charleston, South Carolina, with no family listed, no kinship relations documented, no indication of how he had survived the war years or found himself in Charleston. Another, recorded as Margaret, appears in 1880 records as a domestic worker in Atlanta, with no known relations, no documentation of family, no explanation of her origins or history. What made this erasure particularly effective was its complicity with the legal structures that governed American society. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery in the United States. But the amendment's language was carefully constructed. It abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. More significantly, it created a legal vacuum regarding family rights, inheritance claims, and the restoration of familial relationships that had been deliberately severed during slavery. Children born into slavery, whose parentage had been deliberately obscured in institutional records, whose biological families had been systematically destroyed, found themselves unable to claim any inheritance, any legal standing, any official acknowledgement of their biological family connections. Historian Regina Wells, working with Whitmore, conducted extensive research into the legal mechanisms that perpetuated the erasure of the Ravens Hollow children. She found that former slaveholders and their legal representatives actively worked in the years immediately following the Civil War to ensure that claims of inheritance or family relationship by formerly enslaved individuals would be legally blocked. They employed lawyers to challenge any documentation of kinship, to argue that no legitimate family relationships existed between enslaved people and white plantation owners, to prevent any legal transfer of property or rights that might result from acknowledged family ties. The Ravens Hollow family, through their attorneys, initiated legal proceedings in the early 1870s to consolidate their property and clarify inheritance patterns. The proceedings, documented in Georgia court records, made no mention of the 12 children, made no acknowledgement that the Ravens Hollow patriarchs had fathered children with enslaved women, made no discussion of any biological relationships that might complicate the distribution of the estate. The family's legal strategy was complete erasure from the official record. As long as the children were never formally acknowledged as family members, as long as their existence remained in the realm of scandal and whispered family secrets rather than legal documentation, their claims to inheritance or legitimacy could be dismissed. The dispersion of the 12 children can be understood partially as deliberate administrative choice. The plantation family had multiple options available to them in the years after the Civil War. As slavery transitioned from formal legal system to the informal systems of segregation and economic domination that would characterize the Jim Crow South. They could have acknowledged the children, brought them into the white family structure, provided them with education and resources. This would have been unprecedented and would have violated every social norm of the Southern white community, but it was technically possible. Other plantation families had made similar choices, though they were rare and always carefully hidden. Instead, the Ravens Hollow family chose systematic dispersal. The children were scattered, sometimes within Georgia, sometimes transferred to other states. Some received minimal educational resources. Others, nothing at all. Some were placed in situations where they could pass as white, given the ambiguity of their ancestry. Others were clearly situated within the black community, forced to navigate the racial structures of the post-Civil War South with no resources, no documentation of their history, no explanation of who they were or where they came from. The mechanism of erasure operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the institutional level, official records were manipulated, documents were destroyed, registrations were modified. At the legal level, inheritance laws were weaponized against claims of kinship or legitimacy. At the social level, the children were made invisible through the deliberate silence of their white family, through the suppression of any public acknowledgement of their existence or relationship to the plantation family. At the intimate level, family members were forced to maintain silence about relationships and connections they knew to be true, forced to live with the knowledge that they had brothers and sisters whom they could never claim, cousins whom they could never acknowledge. Meanwhile, the white Ravens Hollow family rewrote its own narrative. By the 1880s, family genealogies, professionally produced documents commissioned from genealogists and circulated among elite Southern circles, made no mention of the 12 children documented in the 1852 photograph. The genealogies that survive in archives today read as if the Ravens Hollow family had reproduced itself through entirely legitimate, socially acceptable mechanisms. No mention of the children. No trace of their existence. The genealogies were curated, edited, and published with meticulous attention, to which branches of the family tree would be preserved and which would be pruned from the record. Some of the children, likely those with the lightest skin, those whose appearance allowed them to pass as white without question, may have been deliberately absorbed into the white family genealogy entirely. Their parentage may have been known only through whispered family secrets, conversations that occurred only in private, knowledge that was carried by certain family members but never documented, never formalized, never officially acknowledged. Over generations, even that informal knowledge may have been lost, as the family members who knew the truth died, taking their secrets with them. The machinery of erasure operated with remarkable efficiency. Within a generation of the Civil War's end, the systematic documentation of the 12 children had been replaced by systematic documentation of their non-existence. Birth records that had suggested their parentage were destroyed or obscured. Ledgers that had tracked their development as property were consigned to archives where most scholars would not think to look for them. Family genealogies that might have revealed their existence were rewritten to exclude them. By the turn of the 20th century, the 12 children of Ravens Hollow had been scattered across time and space, their connection to each other severed, their connection to the plantation severed, their family relationships replaced by institutional invisibility. Chapter 5. The Archival Breakthrough. In 2022, a court case in rural Georgia unexpectedly reopened access to previously sealed legal documents that would prove transformative for the Ravens Hollow investigation. A descendant of the Ravens Hollow family, a woman named Elizabeth Ravens Hollow Patterson living in Atlanta, had filed a lawsuit regarding land inheritance disputes. Elizabeth had discovered inconsistencies in her family's property records, documentation suggesting that certain parcels of land had been transferred, sold, or disappeared from family records over the decades. She hired a lawyer to investigate the matter, hoping to recover property or financial compensation for what she believed had been lost through mismanagement or deliberate fraud by other family members. The lawsuit, Patterson vs. Ravens Hollow Estate Trust, became a matter of public legal proceeding. As part of the discovery process, the legal requirement that both parties in a lawsuit make available all documentation relevant to the case. Decades of family legal correspondence was required to be produced to the court. This correspondence had been preserved in a private law office in Savannah, Georgia, maintained by attorneys who had represented the Ravens Hollow family for over 100 years. The documents had never been intended for public access. They were private family communications, not meant to be examined by historians or journalists or anyone outside the family and their legal representatives. But once litigation commenced, the sealing of these documents could no longer be maintained. Certain documents were placed under protective order, their release restricted to the immediate parties and their legal representatives. but through careful research and multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, Dr. Whitmore and her research team were eventually able to access copies of the most significant correspondence. What they discovered was extraordinary. The letters dated from 1858 to 1862, a 4-year period that corresponded with the final years before the Civil War and encompassed the moment of the daguerreotype's creation. The correspondence was between the Ravenshollow plantation patriarch, a man named James Madison Ravenshollow, and a family attorney based in Savannah named William Thornton. The letters were explicit in ways that no other documentation had been, discussing openly, with striking candor, the practical and legal implications of the reproduction program that was occurring at Ravenshollow. One letter, dated March 1859, began with a seemingly innocuous query, but then descended into something far more sinister. "I write to request your counsel regarding the legal disposition of issue resulting from our domestic arrangements. The matter has become increasingly complex, and I find myself uncertain regarding the most prudent course of action. My cousin insists that certain documentation should be maintained for future reference, while I incline toward discretion. What are the legal implications of each approach?" The attorney's response, dated April 1859, was methodical and comprehensive. Thornton outlined multiple options available to the plantation family, discussing the legal framework governing enslaved reproduction, the property rights implications of acknowledging paternity, the inheritance questions that might arise if certain relationships were formally documented. He advised, "Regarding your inquiry about the legal disposition of children resulting from conjugal relations between white family members and enslaved women, the law is clear that such children remain enslaved property, regardless of their paternity. However, the question of legitimacy is distinct from the question of slavery status. Should you wish to maintain certain family relationships informally without legal recognition, the law provides ample opportunity for such discretion." But the most chilling correspondence came in a series of letters from 1860 and 1861, when the family apparently decided to commission the daguerreotype and sought the attorney's counsel on how to handle the documentation. One letter, dated October 1860, requested, "My cousin continues to insist on having a proper record of the current state of our domestic population. He argues that such documentation might prove valuable in future legal proceedings, particularly should circumstances regarding the legal status of certain individuals become subject to dispute or challenge. I have reluctantly consented to a formal photograph. A daguerreotypist has been engaged, and I have instructed him to ask no questions regarding the composition of the group or the purpose of the photograph. The image will serve as our private documentation and, should ever inquiry be made in future years, can be interpreted as one sees fit." Thornton's response indicated that the attorney had understood the implications entirely. "Your proposed course regarding the photographic documentation is sound. The image will provide a private record without creating any explicit documentary liability. Should the matter become subject to legal inquiry in future years, such an image can be interpreted as simple family portraiture, innocent of any more complex implications. I would advise maintaining the original in secure, private storage, separate from any official family records that might be subject to public inspection or legal discovery." Another letter, dated February 1861, just months after the daguerreotype was created, discussed the practical mechanics of the reproductive program itself. The plantation patriarch wrote, "The medical monitoring you inquired about has proceeded according to plan. Dr. Hartwell has maintained detailed records of the pregnancies under his supervision, and the outcomes have been favorable. The recent birth brought the total to 12 viable offspring of the age and quality specified. The financial implications are considerable. Based on current market rates for enslaved persons of similar age and capacity, the value of the population increase over the past decade approaches $15,000. This represents a significant return on the investment of supervision and medical resources. The attorney's response to this letter was even more clinical, discussing the financial and legal advantages of the reproduction program. The investment in medical supervision has clearly yielded profitable results. The 12 individuals you reference represent considerable added capital to your property holdings. I would advise maintaining detailed financial records of all expenses associated with the program, as such documentation may prove valuable in establishing the total value of the estate should legal questions arise regarding inheritance or property division. These letters, when discovered and made public through academic publications and media coverage, transformed the nature of historical understanding regarding Ravens Hollow. They provided documentary evidence of deliberate conspiracy, of calculated deception, of systematic exploitation. They were not accounts of ordinary plantation life or typical antebellum family dysfunction. They were blueprints of industrial-scale reproductive coercion, drafted and discussed with the clinical precision of legal strategy and financial calculation. The correspondence revealed that what had occurred at Ravens Hollow was not a matter of individual moral failing or personal sexual misconduct. It was a systematized enterprise, managed with medical oversight, discussed with attorneys, understood by the family as a profitable investment. The 12 children documented in the daguerreotype were not accidental outcomes of individual relationships. They were deliberately produced, managed, and documented as property. Their value calculated in financial terms, their existence justified through economic rationale. When these letters were published in academic journals and covered by major media outlets in 2023, the response was significant. Scholars who had been skeptical of Whitmore's earlier claims revised their positions. Legal scholars began examining the implications of these documents for understanding slavery's legal and economic structures. The genealogy of reproductive violence at American plantations began to receive sustained historical attention. The Ravens Hollow documents became central to a broader historical reckoning with how systematically reproductive violence had been woven into American slavery. Most significantly, the letters provided a direct explanation for the daguerreotype itself. It had not been created as a family keepsake or sentimental record. It had been deliberately commissioned as documentation of the plantation family's achievement, a visual record of the reproductive program's success, created for the family's private satisfaction, meant to be understood by only those within the power structure. That the photograph had survived, that it had eventually fallen into institutional collections, that it had been discovered and analyzed by researchers. This was precisely what the family had feared when they discussed the implications of documentation in their private correspondence. Chapter 6. The Descendants' Reckoning. By 2023, the genealogical network had expanded dramatically through DNA testing, archival collaboration, and systematic interviews with families descended from Ravens Hollow. Through a combination of genomic analysis and historical documentation, researchers identified living descendants of all 12 children photographed in the 1852 daguerreotype. These descendants, numbering in the hundreds across multiple states, multiple racial communities, multiple economic and social circumstances, represented the living legacy of Ravens Hollow's machinery of reproduction and erasure. Many of these descendants had never known their biological connection to Ravens Hollow. Many had been told fragmentary, incomplete or false versions of their family histories. Many discovered their connection to the plantation and to each other only through the process of historical investigation and genealogical reconstruction. The experience of discovering this connection was described by many as profoundly disorienting, identity fracturing, and emotionally overwhelming. The realization that one's own existence could be traced directly to a system of deliberate reproductive violence, that one's family's fragmentation and economic marginalization could be directly attributed to institutional crimes, created a kind of rupture in personal understanding that was difficult to process or articulate. Diana Richardson, a black woman in her 60s living in Atlanta, described her reaction when researchers first contacted her with the information. She had been told throughout her life that her great-grandmother was born somewhere on a plantation, that she was an orphan raised by an uncle in South Carolina. That's all the information her family had ever provided. Diana had grown up without knowing the specificity of her family's trauma, without understanding the mechanisms that had created the particular configuration of her family's poverty and social marginalization. She had known there was something hidden, but she had not known what. When the researchers showed me the photograph and told me my great-grandmother was in it, that my family's existence was documented as property, as an experimental outcome of a systematic rape program, everything changed, Diana said in an interview. It wasn't just historical information. It was understanding that my family's poverty, my lack of inheritance, our fractured relationships, the way we've always had to rebuild from nothing, it all traces directly to this deliberate machinery of destruction. My great-grandmother's body was used to create me, to create my family, to create value for people who then abandoned us. And that violence hasn't stopped. It continues in every economic disadvantage my family faces. She paused, tears visible on her face. For decades, I wondered why we had nothing. I thought it was just bad luck, bad circumstances. Now I know it was theft. My family was stolen. My inheritance was stolen. My identity was stolen. And I'm only learning this now, 170 years later. Another descendant, a mixed-race man named Robert Chen living in North Carolina, experienced a different but equally profound rupture. He had been raised believing his father was entirely of Asian descent, that his mother, a black woman from rural North Carolina, had married into an Asian American community far removed from the history of American slavery and racial violence. He had understood his identity as fundamentally separate from the African American experience, seeing his racial identity as primarily structured through his Asian heritage and the immigrant experience of his father's family. Learning that he was descended from victims of Ravens Hollow's reproductive program forced a complete reconsideration of his personal identity. I realized I had been raised with a false understanding of who I am and where I come from, Robert explained. I thought I was removed from this history, but the history was inside me the whole time. My genetic inheritance includes this violence. My family's circumstances were shaped by this violence, and I had been told a story that allowed me to feel separate from that violence, when really I'm deeply implicated in it, shaped by it, defined by it. Still another descendant, a white woman named Eleanor Thorne, whose family had always claimed distant Ravens Hollow heritage, experienced yet another kind of rupture. She had inherited family stories that portrayed the Ravens Hollow patriarchs as benevolent, even progressive for their era. She had been raised with pride in her family's historical significance and social standing. Learning that her family's wealth and status had been built in part through systematic reproductive coercion forced a reckoning with inherited complicity and historical guilt. I have to confront what it means to have benefited from my ancestors' crimes, Eleanor said, her voice quiet and measured. All the educational advantages I had, the financial security my family provided, the social standing I inherited. I now understand that this came from stolen labor, stolen bodies, stolen lives. I have to ask what I owe to people who are my biological relatives, but whom my family deliberately abandoned. I have to think about how I can possibly make amends for benefits I received that came from injustice. The 300 descendants were invited to participate in a symposium held in Atlanta in October 2023, organized by Dr. Whitmore and a coalition of community organizations, educational institutions, and historical societies. The symposium brought together descendants, historians, genealogists, educators, and community members to discuss the findings, share family histories, and begin the work of collective remembrance and reckoning. The symposium was emotionally intense and sometimes painful. Descendants met each other for the first time, discovering siblings and cousins who had been unknown to them. They shared family stories and oral histories. They examined the photograph together, each person looking for faces they recognized, searching for visual evidence of their own genetic inheritance in the daguerreotype's image. A foundation was established, the Ravens Hollow Descendants Foundation, to provide financial support, educational resources, and institutional advocacy for descendants of the enslaved women exploited at Ravens Hollow. Initial funding came from a combination of university endowments, private donors, and contributions from some members of the white Ravens Hollow family who had themselves undergone reckoning with their family's history and wished to make financial restitution. Educational initiatives were launched. College scholarships were established specifically for descendants. A research center was created at a local university dedicated to studying the mechanisms of reproductive violence at American plantations. Community healing efforts were begun. Therapy programs, support groups, community spaces for descendants to process their experiences and their connection to historical trauma. But the fundamental rupture remained. The 12 children of the 1852 photograph had been deliberately destroyed as a family unit, deliberately scattered, deliberately denied their connection to each other and to their rightful inheritance. The acknowledgement came 170 years too late to restore what had been lost, to compensate for what had been taken, to undo the intergenerational damage that had been inflicted on the descendants. If this story has captured you, please leave a like. It helps the story of Ravens Hollow's survivors reach more people. Your engagement helps ensure that these voices, these histories, these claims to justice and remembrance are heard. Thank you for listening. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Dirt. In 2024, archaeologists from a consortium of universities received formal permission to excavate the grounds surrounding the ruins of Ravens Hollow Plantation. The excavation had been requested by descendants and approved by the current landowners through a process of negotiation and institutional cooperation. The goal was to locate and document physical evidence of enslaved life at the plantation, to recover material, remains that might provide information about daily existence, health conditions, and the circumstances of death for the people who had lived and been exploited at Ravens Hollow. What the archaeologists discovered beneath the soil substantiated, expanded, and materially confirmed the documentary evidence that researchers had accumulated through archival investigation. In a section of the grounds, near the remains of what had been the slave quarters, approximately 100 meters from the main foundation, they uncovered an cemetery, unmarked, unmapped, recorded in no official documents, its very existence erased from institutional history. The grave markers, where they existed, were crude and temporary, wooden stakes weathered to fragments, stones that bore no inscriptions. Most graves were marked only by slight depressions in the earth, visible only to someone trained in recognizing such features. The graves contained the remains of 23 individuals spanning approximately 50 years, from roughly 1820 to 1870. Forensic analysis of the skeletal remains provided extraordinary information about the lives and deaths of these individuals. Most of the recovered remains belonged to women, suggesting that the cemetery had particular significance within the enslaved community's practices of burial and commemoration. Multiple female remains showed evidence of repeated pregnancies, skeletal markers visible on pelvic bones that indicated multiple gestations. Several showed evidence of childbirth occurring at young ages, suggesting that pregnancies had begun in adolescence or even earlier. Most significantly, many of the skeletal remains showed evidence of repeated trauma and violence. Some bones bore healed fractures suggesting violent injury. Others showed permanent deformities resulting from untreated injuries. Several skulls bore evidence of blunt force trauma, evidence that suggested death had resulted from beating or violent assault. Multiple ribs bore evidence of stress fractures consistent with heavy physical labor or violence. The bones themselves told a story of bodies subjected to systematic violence, exploitation, and injury. Soil analysis from around several graves revealed elevated levels of mercury and arsenic, consistent with 19th-century medical treatments, particularly treatments used in obstetrics and gynecology. Mercury was used in treatment of syphilis and other venereal diseases. Arsenic was used in various patent medicines and medical treatments. The elevated concentrations in the soil surrounding certain graves suggested that individuals had been subjected to medical interventions involving these substances. But the purpose of such interventions, whether therapeutic or deliberately poisonous, remained unclear. One grave stood apart from all the others in ways that suggested different treatment and different social significance. It contained the remains of an infant, buried in what appeared to be white fabric, textile fragments that suggested formal burial materials rather than the tattered burial cloths found with other remains. The grave location, the careful placement of the small skeleton, the quality of the burial materials, all suggested that this child had been given a burial consistent with the white family's burial practices, rather than the enslaved community's typical burial customs. DNA analysis, when conducted on the infant's remains, ultimately confirmed what material analysis had suggested. This infant was biologically related to the Ravens Hollow family patriarchs. The genetic profiles matched DNA samples from known descendants of the White family. The identification of the mother remained unknown, as does the cause of death. There was no documentation, no record of this child's birth or death, no explanation of who the mother was, but the careful burial suggested that the child had been acknowledged, at least in death, as part of the family, even though the child's existence would have violated every norm of white Southern society. The discovery raised troubling questions. Had this child been recognized as family only after death? Had the child been born illegitimate to a white family member, a scandal hidden during life but acknowledged through funeral practices? Or had the child been deliberately eliminated because of the complications that its existence created, then buried with these formal honors to conceal or deny the circumstances of its death? The archaeological record could not definitively answer these questions, but its physical existence contradicted the official silence, provided material evidence that this person, this child, had existed, had been acknowledged, had been deliberately hidden. These archaeological findings provided physical evidence that the documentary record had attempted to conceal. They proved that the 12 children of the photograph were not an isolated case study of genealogical confusion or reproductive dysfunction. They were part of a systematic, generations-long enterprise of reproductive violence and exploitation that had left physical evidence in the earth itself, material testimony that could not be denied or explained away through institutional silence. The remains recovered from the Ravens Hollow Cemetery became subjects of extensive anthropological study. Academic articles were published analyzing the health conditions evident in the skeletal remains, the patterns of violence visible in the bones, the evidence of medical exploitation preserved in soil chemistry. The cemetery itself became a site of historical commemoration, marked with monuments acknowledging the individuals buried there and the violence they had experienced. For descendants, the archaeological discoveries provided a kind of material confirmation of their family histories. Josephine Carter, the elderly woman who had broken her family's silence to speak with Dr. Whitmore, attended the excavation ceremonies. Standing in front of the cemetery, looking at the archaeological remains being carefully documented and preserved, she wept again. But this time, she said, the tears felt different. "These are my people," she said quietly, looking at the grave sites. "These are people in my family line. They're being acknowledged, being recognized, finally being treated with dignity and respect. For so long they were just gone, disappeared, not acknowledged. Now we're saying they mattered, they existed, they deserve to be remembered. That means something. That means our family's pain is finally being acknowledged." Chapter 8. The Photograph's Second Life. The daguerreotype of the 12 children began to circulate in academic journals, museum exhibitions, and public archives with increasing frequency as the historical investigation expanded, and the significance of the photograph became more widely understood. But its circulation fundamentally transformed its meaning and significance. What had been a historical artifact, a curiosity from the antebellum South, a formal Victorian portrait documenting the white planter elite, became a document of profound accusation, a piece of evidence in an ongoing historical reckoning with slavery, reproductive violence, and institutional erasure. Each time the photograph was reproduced in academic articles, displayed in museum exhibitions, or included in documentary films, it asked a fundamental question that grew more insistent with each display. Who were these 12 children? What happened to them after this photograph was taken? Why were they erased from official history? How did it come to pass that a documentation of reproductive crimes survived, hidden and forgotten, for more than 150 years? In 2025, the daguerreotype was acquired by the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture after a competitive bidding process that involved multiple institutions and communities vying for possession and control of the photograph. The acquisition was itself historically significant. The decision to place the image in a museum dedicated to African American history and experience represented an institutional acknowledgement that the photograph belonged to the story of Black America, not simply to the history of Southern plantation elites. The photograph was placed in permanent exhibition, part of a comprehensive historical presentation titled The 12, Ravens Hollow, and the Machinery of Erasure. The exhibition displayed the photograph alongside documentary evidence, the attorney's letters discussing the reproductive program, pages from plantation ledgers showing the systematic manipulation of birth records, archaeological drawings and photographs from the cemetery excavation, DNA analysis results confirming biological relationships, and oral history interviews with descendants speaking about their discoveries and their ongoing processes of reckoning. The exhibition became one of the most visited and most discussed exhibits in the Smithsonian's history, attracting more than 200,000 visitors in its first year. For many visitors, the exhibition was their first direct encounter with evidence of slavery's reproductive exploitation, a dimension of slavery's violence that had received comparatively little historical attention compared to other aspects of enslaved labor and plantation economics. Viewing the photograph in this exhibition context fundamentally transformed its function and meaning. It was no longer a sentimental family portrait documenting the existence and prosperity of the White Ravens Hollow family. It was no longer simply a historical artifact of photographic technology or dress practices. It was an indictment of American slavery and the sexual violence embedded within it. The formal poses, the Victorian clothing, the careful composition, the studied dignity of the children's expressions, all of these elements now read as documentation of a crime, a cataloguing of victims, a record of the careful orchestration of reproductive violence. The photographer, whoever he was, had been complicit. He had captured evidence and then failed to question its creation. He had accepted the commission, created the image, and then, presumably, remained silent about what the photograph actually documented. The daguerreotypist survived. If he felt any moral qualms about his work, he left no record of it. But his technical skill and artistic composition created an image that would, 170 years later, become central to the exposure of plantation crimes. Some descendants of the 12 children participated directly in the exhibition's development. They provided consultations regarding how the historical evidence should be presented. They offered their own interpretations of what the photograph meant. They provided oral histories that contextualized the documentary record within the lived experience of their families. One descendant, a woman named Sarah Williams, whose great-grandmother was identified as one of the children in the photograph, stood in front of the photograph in the Smithsonian exhibition and spoke about what it meant to her to see her ancestor's image displayed in a major institution, treated with historical significance and respectful analysis. For so long, my family was nobody to the outside world. Yet, she said, her voice trembling, my great-grandmother was invisible, she was property, she was erased, she was forgotten. She had no name that mattered in official histories, but here in this museum, her face is recognized, her story is told. The violence done to her is acknowledged. It's not justice, nothing can replace what was taken, but it's a kind of dignity that my family never had before. Another descendant, a grandchild of one of the documented children, stood in front of the attorney's letters and described the experience of reading the clinical language in which his family's exploitation had been discussed. To read these letters, to see slavery described in such cold, businesslike terms as an investment, as a financial calculation, it makes the violence even more visible somehow. These weren't crimes of passion or individual cruelty. This was systematic, deliberate, calculated. This was slavery as a business enterprise, treating human beings as livestock. Reading this, understanding my family was treated this way, it makes me angry in a way I didn't expect. Udil, the exhibition also included a section dedicated to the descendants' work of remembrance and reconnection. Photographs of the Descendants Symposium were displayed. Excerpts from interviews with descendants discussing their experiences of discovering their connection to Ravens Hollow were featured. Family trees and genealogical charts showed how the descendants had been scattered and how they were now being reconnected through research and intentional community building. For many visitors to the exhibition, the photograph became an entry point to understanding slavery in dimensions they had not previously considered. The exhibition attracted school groups, university classes, scholars, community members, and international visitors. The photograph became iconic, reproduced in articles, discussed in educational curricula, referenced in historical analyses of American slavery and reproductive violence. The Smithsonian exhibition remained open in Washington, D.C. for 3 years before traveling to other institutions. The traveling exhibition was displayed in Atlanta, in Charleston, in Savannah, in the geographic locations that had been central to the Ravens Hollow story and to the broader history of slavery in the American South. At each location, descendants were invited to share their stories, to participate in community discussions, to connect with other individuals affected by the historical investigation. Most significantly, the photograph's circulation and display created a permanent public record of what had been hidden. It was no longer possible for the Ravenshollow family to maintain its historical narrative of respectability and benevolent plantation management. The photograph and the evidence surrounding it were now public knowledge, accessible to anyone seeking to understand American slavery, American racism, and the mechanisms through which institutional violence had been perpetuated and then hidden.